An Outline of Esoteric Science, Cassette 10, First Side, Evolution and Rebirth. In esotericism, evolution is the process whereby the potentialities of the one life are actualized or brought into effective being by the development of upadhis, or vehicles, to give expression to them. We have said something about monad earlier. By definition, it is the combination of spirit, atma, and its vehicle, buddhi. It is the power behind the evolutionary process. HBB has said that during Manvantara, the period of cosmic activity as opposed to pralaya, or rest, life is ever becoming. This is very expressive. It implies a becoming of something through change, stages of growth, like a plant flowering before bearing fruit. Not once, however, but season after season, cycle after cycle, and so on ad infinitum. The idea of the development of monad can present difficulty. How can it develop properly? It itself, as ultimate and perpetual perfection, cannot develop, but more and more of its inexhaustible potential can be brought forth by the process of ever becoming. This means the bringing forth and development through endless succeeding cycles of manifestation of all life's forms in the objective and even subjective, from our point of view, realms of existence. The total cosmic process is therefore ever becoming, both by the multiplication of its means of expression and by the improvement of existing ones. This is particularly evident after the evolutionary arc has been entered upon. In occultism, this unfolding and development of life's vehicles of expression, as we have seen, takes place both in the inner planes as faculties and on the physical plane. Whereas the conventional system of evolution is along one line, the physical, the occult system has three lines: spiritual, intellectual, and psychic, as well as physical, and always proceeds from within outwards. See the first volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 219. Quoting HBB, "It now becomes plain that there exists in nature a triple evolutionary scheme for the formation of the three periodical upadhis, or rather three separate schemes of evolution, which in our system are inextricably interwoven and interblended at every point. These are the monadic, or spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical evolutions. These three are the finite aspects, or the reflections on the field of cosmic illusion of Atman, the seventh, the one reality. 1. The monadic is, as the name implies, concerned with the growth and development into still higher phases of activity of the monad, in conjunction with 2. The intellectual, represented by the Manasa Jnanis, the solar devas or Agnishvata Pitris, the givers of intelligence and consciousness to man. 3. The physical, represented by the Chayas of the lunar Pitris, round which nature has concreted the present physical body. This body serves as the vehicle for the growth, to use a misleading word, and the transformations through which Manas, owing to accumulation of experiences, of the finite into the infinite, of the transient into the eternal and absolute. Each of these systems has its own laws and is ruled and guided by different sets of the highest jhanis or logoi. Each is represented in the constitution of man, the microcosm of the great macrocosm, and it is the union of these three streams in him which makes him the complex being he now is. That's from the first volume of the SD, page 181. We did not explain fully in Cassette 8, when dealing with anthropogenesis, how man initially on this planet got his physical body, except to say that it was built on a model developed in a previous planetary chain. This chain is said to have provided the ideal life patterns for our globe, and they are transferred to our planet during its formative stages, long before it becomes the dense physical globe we now know. As shadows, they impress the ethereal substance of the Earth's astral plane, the second, to form, for example, the model of the linga shariras of the men-to-be. These shadows are the chayas referred to above, but the introduction of these models of the forms of men did not take place until the fourth round on our globe D. Prior to this, the monads destined to become men had to work their way as a recapitulatory process through all the lower kingdoms. The passage quoted above from the SD outlines briefly the evolutionary scheme, more particularly as it relates to our Earth and to man. But we must not forget that it is a universal process. Quoting again, we have the secret doctrine teaches the progressive development of everything, worlds as well as atoms, and this stupendous development has neither conceivable beginning nor conceivable end. Our universe is only one of an infinite number of universes, all of them sons of necessity, because links in the great cosmic chain of universes, each one standing in the relation of an effect as regards its predecessor and being a cause as regards its successor. That's from SD1, page 43. As to the way this grand process is worked out, operated and guided, we have another descriptive passage. The whole order of nature evinces a progressive march towards a higher life. There is design in the action of the seemingly blindest forces. The whole process of evolution, with its endless adaptations, is a proof of this. The immutable laws that weed out the weak and feeble species to make room for the strong, and which ensure the survival of the fittest, though cruel in their immediate action, are all working toward the grand end. The very fact that adaptations do occur, that the fittest do survive in the struggle for existence, shows that what is called unconscious nature is, in reality, an aggregate of forces manipulated by semi-intelligent beings, elementals, guided by high planetary spirits, Jani Chohans. That's from SD1 278. We should notice how the evolutionary process, universal and planetary, is described here in outline in very few words. Unconscious nature is, in reality, an aggregate of forces manipulated by semi-intelligent beings, elementals, guided by Johnny Johans. This is the modus operandi of the hierarchies operating throughout nature, and in fact constituting it, as the next few words show. Quoting again, whose, that is the Johnny Johans, collective aggregate forms the manifested verbum, the second logos of the unmanifested first logos, and constitutes at one and the same time the mind of the universe, the third logos, and its immutable law. SD 1 to 77. Applying some of the generalities so far given, we can now look at the grand evolutionary process as it applies to our planet and our humanity, which, let it never be forgotten, means all and each of us individually, including the reader and the writer of this. Collectively, we are humanity. Talking of the process and what keeps it going, we have the following. That which propels towards and forces evolution, that is, compels growth and development of man towards perfection, is A, the monad, or that which acts in it unconsciously through a force inherent in itself, and B, the lower astral body or personal self. The former, that is the monad, whether imprisoned in a vegetable or animal body, is endowed with, is indeed itself that force. Owing to the identity with the all force, which, as said, is inherent in the monad, it is all potent in the or on the arupa or formless plane. On our plane, its essence being too pure, it remains all potential, but individually becomes inactive. For example, the rays of the sun, which contribute to the growth of vegetation, do not select this or that plant to shine upon. Uproot the plant and transfer it to a piece of soil where the sun can't reach it, and the latter will not follow it. So with Atman, unless the higher self or ego gravitates towards its son, the monad, the lower ego or personal self will have the upper hand in every case, for it is this latter ego, with its fierce selfishness and animal desire to live a senseless life, Tana, which is the maker of the tabernacle. That's quoted from SD2, page 109. The rest of this passage has to do with man's spiritual development. The passage shows how Atman, or the monad, is not only the motive force behind evolution, but that it is impersonal and non-selective. It operates through all nature, including each of us, in all aspects of our being. But we have to set up the conditions to make contact with it in consciousness. For us human beings, this is perhaps our ultimate goal in the evolutionary scheme on this globe. After this, all else will be added unto us. The lower astral body of the personal self compels growth and development towards perfection by way of karma, or desire, which urges us to action and thence to experience. Were it not, however, for the combination of our lower vehicles, no desire or volition could affect the body, and in any case without them there would be no body to act at the physical level. In other words, at our stage, no matter what promptings may come from on high, from the spiritual ego, it is the whole man who must learn to experience them and then to give them expression in his living. The development of inner response to spiritual promptings is yet another aspect of the evolutionary plan. The passage quoted at the start of this cassette referred to 3 lines of evolution. We should perhaps look at these in the light of further information given. The physical level, although man's physical vehicle was particularly mentioned, applies to all the kingdoms of nature on this planet. There are 3 elemental kingdoms about which we were told very little. Then there is the mineral, about which we were told more, especially by way of comparison with the then findings of physical and chemical science. And then there are the vegetable and animal kingdoms. Considering elements, the periodic table of the elements adopted by chemical science, with its 100 or so varieties, comprising what we know as the mineral kingdom, is accepted generally in esoteric science, but it is claimed there are in fact more elements than are shown on that table. According to occultism, all physical matter is the end of the process of increasing densification down through the planes of manifestation until ultimate consolidation is achieved in what we know as solids here on the physical plane. The process could possibly be accepted by modern science, but as yet only as a hypothesis. It cannot be demonstrated on any instrument, however delicate, because any plane above the physical is of a different order of being. There are some seeming exceptions to this rule, in that auras of living things can be made visible by Kilner screens or Kirlian photography, but it is not established what the nature of these auras really is in occult terms. Normally, no plane can, so to speak, communicate directly with another either above or below it, because of the dividing layer condition. Each has its own set of appropriate senses. Consciousness, however, can function on the different planes when the faculties for doing so are developed. For example, most of us can be, and often are, affected by the psychic atmosphere surrounding a person or place, without our being, knowingly or otherwise, obviously mediumistic. Signals or impulses from higher planes, before they can register in any way on the physical plane, have to be transformed by living organs designed to do so. Our physical brains are such organs. They respond directly or via our nervous system to external stimuli, and the astral vehicle, with its counterpart brain, responds to emotional and mental signals. The mental principle, at its higher levels, is sensitive to impulses from spiritual levels. We should note that such spiritual impulses cannot act directly in or on physical matter, in consciousness or otherwise. At that gross level, spirit can only act as the crude energy within the constituent atoms of matter. We can measure with physical instruments the electrical nerve currents which control our muscles, and we can measure electrical charges in the brain as various states of consciousness are entered. These changes tell us nothing, however, of what the person is experiencing. All we can tell is the state of mind, i.e. whether it's alert or dormant, relaxed or active, etc., and even whether an altered state of consciousness has been achieved, as in meditation. But we learn nothing of the actual experience. Physical instruments can react to physical effects only. Stimuli from inner planes can only register subjectively in the consciousness of a living transducer. The transducer can be a single cell or an aggregate of cells, for example, an organ such as the brain itself. Each cell has its inner vehicles, and aggregates of cells have a corresponding aggregate of inner vehicles, which collectively form a vehicle for a transcending unit consciousness. We, as units of consciousness, are aware of what comes to our attention via our organs, both inner and outer. Now, this may sound irrelevant to our subject of evolution, but it's not. What has been described above, i.e. the development of vehicles, is the process which nature uses for unfolding and bringing into manifestation the potentialities of spirit, and thereby expanding consciousness. It is possible, however, to express spiritual impulses at lower levels, only according to the responsiveness of the vehicle that the spirit is operating through. The transforming medium, as living organisms or organs, have first to be brought into being and then continually developed, each in a specific way according to its kind and level of internal function. The pressure to produce these means of response and action is always from within outwards, as we have seen. All this is a huge generality, the expression of an overriding, all-embracing rule. In the light of it, however, we have a comprehensive answer to many questions that can be asked about the evolutionary process. Not only do the means of response to the higher life impulses, the transformers and transducers, have to be formed and developed on the inner planes, and all this by stages as instanced in the planes, but similarly by stages do such means of expression have to be projected into the physical world. And insofar as this has been accomplished, we have developed faculties. These developments are also exemplified in the big scale in the kingdoms of nature, and each kingdom forms a foundation or base through which the one above it can find expression. It is readily seen how the life potentialities are progressively realized as we pass upwards through the kingdoms. Faculty, as the ability to do things, and consciousness in terms of awareness and response, develop, increase, or expand, culminating in the degree of skill, physical and mental, and the extent of awareness attained by man, as the life waves move up through the kingdoms. Reverting to physical matter, as we normally regard it on this plane, modern subatomic physics appears to be corroborating the occult view of an original primeval energy substance, even an ultimate atomic particle. In and from this original energy substance, particles of numerous and various kinds arise to form, by diverse aggregations, atoms of known elements, and by permutations and combinations, of the basic elemental qualities, their characteristics are imparted to them. Occultism agrees with the idea of an homogeneous, original, rudimentary stuff from which atomic substance differentiates. But it adds that the individual characteristics of the various physical elements are reflections of those already existing in the inner worlds. They did not arise by reason of chance combinations of primary particles, that is, energy, mass, centers at physical level. But inner designs and forces determined their characteristics, and this in due season, as and when they were needed, to form vehicles to express unfolding life potentials in the developing kingdoms. This was done by producing the ever more complex molecules which provide the vast range of properties we find in both inorganic and organic compounds. The enzymes necessary to so many organic chemical processes are typical examples of the intelligence of nature's microorganisms, knowing how and being able to perform such vital functions. The mineral which provides the vegetable and animal kingdoms with their necessary elementary materials is itself the expression of countless elemental lives. The physical forms of the kingdoms already exist in the inner worlds and are brought forth and developed by building dense physical material bodies around their astral models. This building is the work of the elementals, who evolved in their own kingdoms to be able to perform this function. The members of the upper hierarchies, as we have seen, act as the architects and directors, right from the start of the Genesis process through all the subsequent development processes to the end of the chain. The origination and the subsequent development processes are the same in principle. Everything works from within to without, under guidance from above. In the evolution of man, there are the three lines of evolution we have already mentioned: the spiritual, the psychic, including the lower mental, and the physical, with its related inner astral and vital principles. We have seen a little of the origin of these, but not of the process of their evolutionary development in man. In a very interesting way, these are reflected into the methods of reproduction now to be seen in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, which we referred to in Cassette 9. It must be remembered that man has only been more or less as we now know him in his physical form, with a functioning mind principle, since the third race of this fourth round. But he had to pass through development stages prior to that, when he was not recognizably human as he now is. It's not possible to separate man's origins, which involve both the genesis of and his arrival on this planet, and the coming together, so to speak, of his various parts or principles at different coincidental stages of his and the Earth's history, from the origins and development of the planet, which both nurtures him and provides the field for his development. We are told that in this round his physical development has been virtually completed, From here on, his further development is in his mental and spiritual faculties. The spiritual being evidenced in the increasing expression of the higher human qualities of, for example, sympathy, unselfishness or altruism, a sense of duty and responsibility, integrity, self-control, and compassion, all tending to a withdrawal from the personal I and its interests, to a concern for humanity as a whole, for all life on our planet. As the fifth round succeeds our fourth round, there will be the development of physical senses not yet available to us, additional to the 5 we already have. The next one to develop, we are told, will be the ability to see and hear through otherwise solid material. This will begin to be apparent in some of us even towards the end of the 5th race. As an illustration of how the environmental conditions in which men live change as he changes, it is said that together with the development of this 6th sense, matter will change or become permeable. This is a condition of matter with which even now elementals can function. This enables an adept who has control of the elementals to perform seeming miracles, like having apparently solid objects pass through one another, like the links of a metal chain, so as either to form or break the continuity of the chain. To revert to man's evolution, this, in the first 3 rounds on our planet, and in the preceding subjective globes in this round, we have very little information about. Man then and there was really only what is to become man. The monad was then in, so to say, its undeveloped state. But of him in his early stages in our round, and how the stages reflected into how he then procreated himself, of which we said a little in the last cassette, we have the following from SD2, page 166. Methods of reproduction of early human races. 1. Fission. A, as seen in the division of the homogeneous speck of protoplasm known as moneron or amoeba into 2. B, as seen in the division of the nucleated cell, in which the cell nucleus splits into 2 subnuclei, which either develop within the original cell wall or burst it and multiply outside as independent entities. Compare the first root race. 2. Budding. A small portion of the parent structure swells out at the surface and finally parts company, growing to the size of the original organism. For example, in many vegetables, the sea anemone, etc. Compare the second root race. 3. Spores. A single cell thrown off by the parent organism, which develops in a multicellular organism reproducing the features of the latter, for example, bacteria and mosses. 4. Intermediate hermaphroditism. Male and female organs inhering in the same individual. For example, the majority of plants, worms and snails, etc., allied to budding. Compare second and early third root races. 5. True sexual union. Compare the later third root race. This is the story of the development of the reproductive process in man, but it's important to note that each stage of the process is still used in the vegetable and animal kingdoms. Another important point to notice, which corroborates the occult theory of evolution, is that nature can only proceed to a more advanced stage of development of any form by recapitulating quickly in its embryonic stages the stages of development it has already passed through. In the long-term unfoldment of the potential faculties of monad and the forms it had to develop to give them expression, it has had to pass through the elemental kingdoms, the mineral kingdom, the vegetable and animal kingdoms before entering the human kingdom. This vast life history has to be recapitulated every time anything comes into being. The recapitulation is more rapid the older the experience. For example, in the case of a human being, the story now only starts with the presence of an ovum. In the same way, however, that the ovum is formed, so is the male gamete or germ cell. Not only are they both produced by fission and budding, but as cells they are composed of organic matter as their living substance. From the moment of conception, the development of the fetus recapitulates that of plants up to a point, and then it goes through animal forms, gills, a tail, and so on, up to its becoming recognizably human. HBB also points out, in a footnote to page 167 of the second volume of the SD, that every process of healing and cicatrization, scar making, or the process of healing over, in the higher animal groups, even in the case of reproduction of mutilated limbs with the amphibians, is effected by fission and gamation, budding, of the elementary morphological elements. Morphological means pertaining to form, development of living structures. Man is a thinking being, and to make this subject of evolution particularly relevant to him, we should see something of his intellectual beginnings and development. We have seen in Cassette 8 that his mental faculty was bestowed on otherwise mindless man by beings from another world chain, who had themselves developed mind. These beings had many names, but in the following extract they are referred to as the sons of wisdom. Quoting, "We now come to an important point with regard to the double evolution of the human race. The sons of wisdom, or the spiritual jhanis, had become intellectual through their contact with matter, because they had already reached, during previous cycles of incarnation, that degree of intellect which enabled them to become independent and self-conscious entities on this plane of matter. They were reborn only by reason of karmic effects. They entered those who were ready and became the arhats, or sages, alluded to above." Now this needs explanation. It does not mean that monads entered forms in which monads already were. They were essences, intelligences, and conscious spirits, entities seeking to become still more conscious by uniting with more developed matter. Their essence was too pure to be distinct from the universal essence, but their egos, or manas, since they are called Manasaputras, born of Mahat or Brahma, had to pass through earthly human experience to become all-wise and be able to start on the returning ascending cycle. It's not in the course of natural law that man should become a perfect septenary being before the seventh race in the seventh round. Yet he has all these principles latent in him from his birth. Nor is it part of the evolutionary law that the fifth principle, manas, should receive its complete development before the fifth round. That's from the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 167. The processes of evolution are inextricably interwoven with those of origins, because, as we have seen, everything along the line of development had its antecedents, and not all antecedents were equal in development at any given time. Particularly does this affect humankind, which got its being from ancestors. The above passage goes on interestingly about the program of man's development and where along the line are some of the races. It says, even in the coming seventh race, at the close of this fourth round, while our four lower principles will be fully developed, that of manas will be only proportionately so. This limitation, however, refers solely to the spiritual development. The intellectual on the physical plane was reached during the fourth root race. Thus, those who were half ready, who received but a spark, constitute the average humanity, which has to acquire its intellectuality during the present manvantaric evolution, after which they will be ready in the next for the full reception of the sons of mind, while those which were not ready at all, the latest monads, which had hardly evolved from their last transitional and lower animal forms at the close of the third round, remained the narrow-brained of the stanza. This explains the otherwise unaccountable degrees of intellectuality among the various races of men. Those whose reasoning powers are very little above the level of the animals are not the unjustly disinherited, the unfavoured, as some may think. They are simply those latest arrivals among the human monads which were not ready, which have to evolve during the present round, also on the three remaining globes, hence on four different planes of being, so as to arrive at the level of the average class when they reach the fifth round. That's from SD2, page 167. There's another interesting observation in this passage. The monads of the lowest specimens of humanity had no karma to work out when first born as men, as their more favoured brethren in intelligence had. The former are spinning out karma only now. The latter are burdened with past, present, and future karma. In this respect, the poor savage is more fortunate than the greatest genius of civilized countries. This look at evolution may not be what a modern student could have expected. It has been written to present a picture of the process on a very broad canvas, and to show that the process is closely related in all its aspects to that of natural law and the timeless process of ever becoming in which we are all involved. The vista of what we as men may become grows more and more breathtaking as the view unfolds, until its ever-expanding grandeur beggars our imagining. We have seen that the whole process of nature, even the whole of cosmos, is an ever-becoming. This expression conveys the idea of perpetual change, transformation, expansion, growth, multiplication, unfoldment, the actualizing of potentiality. a dynamic progression endlessly. And according to occultism, that universal process is always subject to law. The process is the law in operation. We have seen also how the law is that of cause and effect, of balancing wisely, adjusting, harmonizing, by cycles, cycles within cycles, and of progression, stage by stage, with periods of rest alternating with periods of activity. The law is all-embracing, applying to the whole cosmos as a unit, and individually to all the units comprising it. Each cycle completed by anything or anyone is always an advancement on the previous cycle. Life experience in the long run is cumulative. The process is everlasting and non-reversible. There may be apparent regression to the primitive in the short term, but the grand cycle moves everything by classes, groups, grades, nations, etc., step by step, inexorably, onto a temporary state of relative perfection. There's a dual aspect to this development. While it always involves the unfoldment of characteristics or qualities of life, it is effected, on the one hand, by the development of its upadhis, bases or forms, and on the other by the expansion of consciousness, which not only includes an increasing ability of apperception, but an unfoldment of faculty. And faculty we have defined as the ability to do things consciously. The development pressure is always from within, and the development of the form, or upadhi, follows an interior pressure to express a faculty, not the other way round. Quoting, "The Darwinian theory, however, of the transmission of acquired faculties is neither taught nor accepted by occultism. Evolution in it proceeds on quite other lines. The physical, according to esoteric teaching, evolving gradually from the inner, from the spiritual, mental and psychic. This inner soul of the physical cell, this spiritual plasm that dominates the germinal plasm, is the key that must open one day the gates of terra incognita of the biologist, now called the dark mystery of embryology." That's from SD 1, page 219. It is interesting to note man's special place in the evolutionary scale of development. He is the only being on earth who has vehicles or principles corresponding to all the cosmic planes of being, from the physical to the highest spiritual. Further, as we have seen, all monadic development has to pass through the man stage before proceeding on into the superhuman kingdoms. The man stage is therefore a pivotal one. On our physical globe at this stage, man represents the apex of current development. It is often asked, what is the purpose of this endless cyclic development, this ever becoming? When, at the end of all the cosmic days or years of activity, there is the relapse into rest, the pralaya condition, the re-merging into the original source of all. There can obviously be no meaningful answer to this question, at least at any level of being that we can possibly be concerned with at our stage of development. However, the process does involve an ever-increasing expansion of consciousness as the ladder of life is ascended. The question is touched on in the following passage. The unconscious evolved the universe only in the hope of attaining clear self-consciousness, of becoming, in other words, man. For this is also the secret meaning of the usual Puranic phrase about Brahma being constantly moved by the desire to create. This explains also the hidden Kabbalistic meaning of the saying, the breath becomes a stone, the stone a plant, the plant an animal, the animal a man, the man a spirit, and the spirit a god. The mind-born sons, the rishis, the builders, etc., were all men of whatever forms and shapes in other worlds and the preceding Manvantaras. That's from SD1, page 106. And in this we seem to see some purposive progression. Another passage relates the grand process of unfoldment to the expansion of consciousness by its vehicles of expression, in particular the monastic one. This is the only sense in which we can talk of monadic development, monad in itself being eternal and immutable. It therefore of itself cannot progress nor develop. It is not of this world or plane, and may be compared only to an indestructible star of divine light and fire, thrown down on our earth as a plank of salvation for the personalities in which it indwells. It is for the latter to cling to it, and thus, partaking of its divine nature, obtain immortality. Left to itself, the monad will cling to no one, but, like the plank, be drifted away to another incarnation by the unresting current of evolution. That's in a footnote to page 174 of SD1. Continuing the quote, now the evolution of the external form or body round the astral is produced by the terrestrial forces, just as in the case of the lower kingdoms. But the evolution of the internal or real man is purely spiritual. It is now no more than a passage of the impersonal monad through many and various forms of matter, endowed at best with instinct and consciousness on quite a different plane, as in the case of external evolution, but a journey of the pilgrim soul through various states of not only matter, but self-consciousness and self-perception, or of perception from apperception. Still quoting, the monad emerges from its state of spiritual and intellectual unconsciousness, and, skipping the first two planes, too near the absolute to permit of any correlation with anything on a lower plane, it gets directly into the plane of mentality. But there is no plane in the whole universe with a wider margin or a wider field of action in its almost endless gradations of perceptive and apperceptive qualities than this plane, which has, in its turn, an appropriate smaller plane for every form, from the mineral monad up to the time when that monad blossoms forth by evolution into the divine monad. But all the time it is still one and the same monad, differing only in its incarnations, through its ever-succeeding cycles of partial or total obscuration of spirit, or partial or total obscuration of matter. Two polar antitheses, as it ascends into the realms of mental spirituality or descends into the depths of materiality. That's from SD 1, page 175. Because of the importance of the idea that evolutionary development pressure is from within, and that this process is universal and without exception, we reiterate below a confirmation and elaborate the idea, particularly as it affects man. This is a quotation from cassette 2, the second side. The Jaan Chohan has to become one. He cannot be born or appear suddenly on the plane of life as a full-blown angel. The celestial hierarchy of the present Manvantara will find itself transferred in the next cycle of life into higher, superior worlds, and will make room for a new hierarchy, composed of the elect ones of our mankind. Being is an endless cycle within one absolute eternity, wherein move numberless inner cycles, finite and conditioned. That's from SD 1, page 221. Apart from illustrating that no being, not even a Jaan Chohan, can suddenly appear on the plane of being, that is, without going through all the developmental stages leading up to the present one, we saw in cassette 3 how the current human race got all its middle principles from these Jaan Chohans, who are further along the evolutionary path than we are. We, however, have to develop these principles and to integrate them into our being. We only got the germs of them. We have to become full-blown men, as our benefactors had to before us. In considering evolution as it applies to the development of species, HPB poses two questions that she feels are, or were then, not answered by science. One was, what are the forces at work in the formation of the fetus? And what is the cause of hereditary transmission? On side 1, we dealt particularly, or partially, with the question of what propels towards and forces evolution, and the answer was twofold. A, the monad, and B, the lower astral body. The former, the monad, is that force itself, irrespective of the kingdom it is operating in. The latter, astral body, the vehicle for what we may call desire in a general and very broad sense, prompts or impels any forms through which it can operate into action and hence experience. The desire element is the internal stimulus or pressure. This is obviously the case in man, perhaps less obviously in the other kingdoms. But we must interpret this desire as the urge to live, to self-expression, itself an effect of the monadic force operating at that level. This same force is that which impels growth, not only in the fetus, but in anything. And about the cause of the transmission of hereditary characteristics, physical and otherwise, it is obviously a reflection of, or even the means of, fulfilling the cosmic urge to the development of consciousness, self-consciousness. Any gains made must be possible, A, of accumulation, and B, of transmission down or along the generation chains. In this connection, HBB quotes an hypothesis accepted by Professor Weissman, quoting, "These germinal cells do not have their genesis at all in the body of the individual, but proceed directly from the ancestral germinal cell passed from father to son through long generations." That's from SD1, page 223, footnote. And then she asks, whence, however, this cell originally? And answers, complete the physical plasm, the germinal cell of man with all its material potentialities, with the spiritual plasm, so to say, or the fluid that contains the 5 lower principles of the 6 principled jhani, and you have the secret. When the seed of the animal man is cast into the soil of the animal woman, that seed cannot germinate unless it has been fructified by the 5 virtues. That is the fluid of, or the emanations from, the principles of the 6-fold heavenly man. The functions of Jiva on this earth are of a 5-fold character. In the mineral kingdom, it is connected with the lowest principles of the spirits of the earth, the 6-fold jhanis. In the vegetable particle, with the 2nd, the prana, life. In the animal, with all these, plus the 3rd and 4th. That is the astral and the karmic, K-A-M-I-C. In man. In man, the germ must receive the fruition of all the 5, otherwise he will be born no higher than an animal, namely a congenital idiot. Thus, in man alone, the jiva is complete. As to his 7th principle, it is but one of the beams of the universal sun. Each rational creature receives only the temporary loan of that which it has to return to its source, while his physical body is shaped by the lowest terrestrial lives through physical, chemical, and physiological evolution. And from SD1, page 224. The germinal cell, endowed by its ancestors in the distant past with all its principles, inherent in it is, so to speak, a carrier wave, to borrow an expression from radio. A carrier wave is a signal sent out from the transmitter at a particular frequency, but is unmodulated. That is, it contains in itself no information, no message. When speech or music is to be transmitted, this carrier is modulated. That is, speech or music frequencies are superimposed on it. At the receiving end, the receiving apparatus filters out the carrier wave, leaving the speech or music frequencies, which in turn are translated and made available to the listener as the speech or music he hears. We can regard the germinal cell as the racial carrier wave, carrying all humanity's common characteristics. In the case of an individual man, this is modulated by his particular skandhas and inherited family characteristics. In the case of minerals, plants, and animals, their species or type characteristics are superimposed on the germinal cell and on whatever principles have been developed by the monad up to each species or type's stage of development. We saw in cassette 6 that apart from physical characteristics inherited from his parents, a man's personality makeup at birth is determined by his tendencies and predispositions, skandhas, brought over from his previous life. And the actual transmission medium for these is the life atoms, comprising his middle principles, fivefold, as conditioned by him in his previous use of them in his preceding lives. We are seeing that the evolutionary process, as far as the generation and development of any particular class of beings is concerned, is simple in principle, that is, from within outwards. But actually, in any particular case, it is immensely complicated because of the large variety of elements involved in the constitution of any organism. This is particularly the case the higher up the evolutionary scale we go, in, for example, animals and ultimately in man. Reverting to the force behind evolution and its agents, we saw that in the formation of a man's body, the spirits of the earth clothed the shadows and expanded them. This extract proceeds: to these spirits belong temporally the human astral selves, and it is they who give or build the physical tabernacle of man, for the monad and its conscious principle, manas, to dwell in. That's from SD2, page 110. And then we have an interesting reference to the solar spirits, which is a continuation of something said about the sun earlier in the text, where it says, "The Father of that one only thing is the Son, and the one thing being man." That's from SD2, page 109. The same passage not only then explains the part played by the solar spirits in the formation of man, but it goes on to explain how in the development the impulse changes its emphasis after the astrophysical man has been completed to his slow spiritual awakening and growth. It goes on. But the solar laws, LHAS, spirits, warm them, the shadows. This is physically and literally true. Metaphysically, or on the psychic and spiritual plane, it is equally true that the Atman alone warms the inner man. That is, it enlightens it with the ray of divine life, and alone is able to impart to the inner man, or the reincarnating ego, its immortality. Then, from the turning point, it is the higher ego or incarnating principle, the nous or mind, which reigns over the animal ego and rules it whenever it is not carried down by the latter. In short, spirituality is on its ascending arc, and the animal or physical impedes it from steadily progressing on the path of its evolution. Only when the selfishness of the personality has so strongly infected the real inner man with its lethal virus that the upward attraction has lost all its power on the thinking, reasonable man. In sober truth, vice and wickedness are an abnormal, unnatural manifestation at this period of our human evolution. At least, they ought to be so. The fact that mankind was never more selfish and vicious than it is now, civilized nations having succeeded in making of the first, that is the selfishness, an ethical characteristic, and of the second, that is vice, an art, is an additional proof of the exceptional nature of the phenomenon. That's from SD 2, page 110. This extract, leaving aside for the moment HBB's inferential comment at the end, gives us a vision of the evolutionary process in its cyclical aspect. In the big picture, we are concerned with the formation of globes, with the quickening of the globes to be, by the transference to them of the dying chain's life principles, as waves of monads at various stages of development up to and including human monads. Then we are told of the powers or forces behind the various aspects of the process of originating and nurturing the element principles for the developing humanities on our planet. And having completed his constitution, man can then respond significantly to the promptings of his higher self and his progress towards spirituality in consciousness, a process stimulated, as we've seen, by the warmth of Atman. A great cycle is being completed. Man is qualifying for emergence into superhumanity, when he, in his turn, can become a progenitor, a creator and guide to a nascent humanity to be born on another chain. And so the endless process goes on and on, spiraling ever higher and higher as it goes. A point we have perhaps not stressed enough is that as man proceeds on his evolutionary journey, he not only develops his faculties, but in the doing he educates the matter of which they are composed. Such educated matter, as elemental life forms or life atoms, then become available to the monads moving up in the kingdoms below him. Man, as the most advanced being on the globe, is, by his efforts and growth, thereby making possible evolutionary growth for all the creatures below him. And to this extent, he is a creator, making his direct and indirect contribution to the grand process of spiritual unfoldment. Relating this idea to what we have seen of rounds and races, there is a passage which not only mentions it, but introduces us to another and startling one from the point of view of conventional science concerning the much sought-after missing link between man and the anthropoid apes. Talking of the rounds prior to our fourth, quoting, "And finally, the forms and genera of neither man, animal, nor plant were what they became later. Thus the astral prototypes of the lower beings of the animal kingdom of the fourth round, which preceded the chayas of men, were consolidated, though still very ethereal sheaths of the still more ethereal forms or models produced at the close of the third round on globe D, produced from the residue of the substance matter from the dead bodies of men and other extinct animals of the wheel before, or the previous third round. That's from stanza 8, sloka 28, which goes on to tell us, hence, while the nondescript animals that preceded the astral man at the beginning of this life cycle on our earth were still, so to speak, the progeny of the man of the third round, the mammalians of this round owe their existence in a great measure to man again. Moreover, the ancestor of the present anthropoid animal, the ape, is the direct production of the yet mindless man who desecrated his human dignity by putting himself physically on the level of an animal. That's from SD2, page 167 and 8. To be credible to the scientific student, the above statement about the mammals of this round needs a much fuller explanation. The first important point to bear in mind is that the physical conditions on the Earth during the period up to the fourth round, when it consolidated and cooled to become more or less as we know it now, were more ethereal and fluidic. The flora and fauna were such as to be able to thrive in conditions which would be lethal to our present-day physical plants and animals. The second point is that up to the middle of the third root race, in our fourth round, man was mindless. He was not, as we have seen, endowed with mind until the later third race. He was what is referred to in the secret doctrine as narrow-headed. A third point is that from the beginning of this fourth round, nature, unaided, had tried to produce living forms on the model of those of the preceding round. Among these were animal forms, first ethereal and then solid. Quoting, during the third race, the boneless animals grew and changed. They became animals with bones. Their chairs became solid, vertebrates, and after that, mammalians. Before that, the animals were also ethereal proto-organisms, just as man was. That's from ST2, page 183. At this time, early in our fourth round, animals and men were hermaphrodite, each individual having the organs of both sexes in one body, as do, for example, earthworms now. And then stanza 8, shloka 31, tells us, they, the animals, began to breed. The twofold man then separated also. He, man, said, let us as they. Let us unite and make creatures. And they did. But the animals, it tells us, separated first into male and female. That's from SD2, page 184. And then it goes on. And those which had no spark, that is, the narrow-brained, took huge she-animals unto them, and they begat upon them dumb races. Dumb they were, that is, the narrow-brained themselves, but their tongues untied. The tongues of their progeny remained still. Monsters they bred, a race of crooked, red, hair-covered monsters going on all fours. A dumb race to keep the shame untold. That's from SD2 184. We are told that these animals or monsters are not the anthropoid or any other apes, but verily what the anthropologists might call the missing link, the primitive lower man. That's also from SD2 184. But the secret doctrine is careful to tell us repeatedly that at the time that man begot these monsters, he was both mindless and soulless. Nor will they, it says, the missing links, ever be met with. The story of the origin of the apes is not yet completed. What occurred in the early third race, when man was to all intents and purposes irresponsible, was repeated again by the later Atlanteans, when he did know what he was doing. These men mated with the semi-human progeny of the mindless. There are numerous passages in Vol 2 of the Secret Doctrine referring to this interbreeding by men, by this time physical and intelligent, with the female descendants of the original sin of the mindless. It was from these unions that the present anthropoid apes are descended. The great apes, however, have been the subject of evolutionary changes since those times. It is said, incidentally, that since these matings, nature has prevented offspring resulting from unions too widely differing in species. Such unions are either unproductive or, as in the case of mules, the offspring are sterile. The present anthropoids are the exceptions previously referred to in the animal kingdom who can achieve human status on this globe, and that towards the end of the 5th round. It's most important to remember that the egos of the apes are entities compelled by their karma to incarnate in the animal forms which, resulting from the bestiality of the latest third and the earliest fourth race men, are entities who had already reached the human stage before this round. Consequently, they form an exception to the general rule, and, as said above, will all be men in the 5th round. As to the similarity of their features with those of man, the explanation can be partly inferred from the cross-breeding that took place in the third race. But in SD2, page 688, there's a paragraph which is more specific on this point and which explains the fertility of the progeny, so that they continued as a species of anthropoid animals and gave rise as further offshoots to the monkeys. Thus we account for the human, or this accounts for the human features of apes, especially of the later anthropoids, apart from the fact that these latter preserve by heredity a resemblance to their Atlanto-Lemurian sires. Our story of evolution in general also rests on another essential fact, that everything comes into manifestation, that is, objective existence, from within outwards. The within being the vast arena of being normally unperceivable by us physical mortals, but which is, nevertheless, the essence of our being in every respect. And we tend too easily to forget that this is so. It is interesting to note that our increase in knowledge from further finds of fossils and from our modern dating techniques is confirming that man and apes came from a common ancestry. But occult science says that this was human, whereas science infers that it was animal. Modern science, however, does not have regard to the occult teachings on the spiritual and intellectual pedigree of man, nor to those relating to his physical ancestry as having its real origins in the inner invisible worlds, and to its ultimate parentage and make-up in the Jan Chohans. And that's the end of cassette 10.